Have you ever wondered why those who were once manipulated, controlled, and gaslighted to the point of nearly losing themselves can become some of the most quietly powerful, unshakable human beings? It's not because they've never collapsed, it's because they've touched the bottom of disorientation and then returned. Not with revenge, but with new eyes. Carl Jung once said, "What you resist controls you, what you face frees you." And the journey we're about to take in this video is precisely that. The journey of someone who was once manipulated, once blamed, once drowned in the game of psychological reversal, and one day wakes up and stops playing. We're not here to talk about victims in a weak tone. We're here to talk about awakening, about rising, and about what makes someone who was once manipulated become immune to manipulation. No more blame games. No more "I'm good, you're bad" scripts. But a profound inner transformation occurs when the person dares to enter their own inner darkness, dares to face the weakest parts of themselves, and dares to look into the childhood wounds the manipulator exploited. Not to stay a victim, but to move through them. And the fascinating thing is that manipulators, no matter how intelligent, skilled at masking, or strategic, always operate on a repeating pattern. When they realize you can no longer be manipulated, they don't stop. They shift into one final, most dangerous, most sophisticated strategy. What Carl Jung called the reversed shadow. When the wrong is no longer denied, but projected onto you, they throw their entire shadow onto you. And if you're not ready, you'll believe you're the villain. But if you've already begun the individuation process, the journey of becoming your whole self, then you'll see that none of it lands anymore. This video isn't for people seeking cheap sympathy. It's for you. The one who knows you can't live forever in self-doubt. The one who knows healing is not about forgiving the manipulator. It's about never giving them another chance to manipulate you again. Let's begin. Have you ever felt this? Finally finding the courage to walk away from a toxic relationship, holding your head high, shedding all control, and walking off with your dignity intact? And then, when you think the battle is over, just when it seems like you've escaped that venomous shadow, they return. But this time, it's not with familiar flattery or controlling rage. This time, they become quiet, gentle. They start playing the victim. They don't attack you directly anymore. Instead, they do something far more insidious. They make you question yourself. Carl Jung once said, "What you project onto others is what lives within you. And if you're unconscious of it, you'll call it fate." But what happens when someone begins projecting their darkness onto you? When they take the ugliest parts of their soul and hang them like a shattered mirror in front of you saying, "This is who you are." That is when you step into the final psychological weapon of the manipulator, a twisted shadow inversion that Jung warned us about long ago. They dump their entire shadow onto you and then wash their hands clean. At first, it might sound like a simple line. "You've changed. You're not the good person you used to be." Or, "I think you're overreacting." Then slowly they push you into a deep state of confusion. Every action you take, no matter how small, is twisted and reinterpreted as proof that you're the one with the problem. You feel like you're trapped in a psychological maze where every mirror is warped and every exit leads you back to the start. Jung called this psychological vertigo, the dizzying effect of reality being distorted by someone terrified that you might see who they really are. Why do they do this? Because you no longer need them. You've reclaimed your power. You no longer react, no longer beg, no longer fear abandonment. And that, ironically, is the greatest threat to someone who survives by controlling others. When you're no longer fragile, you become the mirror that reflects their own weakness, and they can't bear that reflection. Jung describes such people as souls trapped in darkness, who will do anything to drag you down to where they are, so that they don't feel alone. When you begin individuation, the process of becoming your whole self, you are forced to face your own shadow, but you also force others to face theirs. And if they're not ready, they'll choose the easier path, to dump that shadow onto you. This is no longer ordinary manipulation. This is the final weapon of someone who has no other way left to control you, except by making you destroy yourself. You start to doubt, am I really being too cold? Do you know if I am the one at fault? Am I the toxic person in this story? But remember, the very fact that you're asking those questions from a heart that can self-reflect is proof that you're still awake. A manipulator never asks, "Was I wrong?" They only ask, "Why won't you obey me anymore?" What makes this game so cruel is that it unfolds in silence. No more arguments, no more crying, just a quiet internal spiral as you're pushed back into the invisible cage of self-doubt. But Jung left us a key. He said, every judgment is a confession. When someone repeatedly accuses you of being toxic, selfish, unstable, they may be speaking about themselves without even knowing it. So instead of reacting, stand firm. Treat every accusation as a doorway into their unconscious. Let your calm be the mirror they cannot bend. And if you feel lost in the storm of blame, return to the truth within yourself, where truth doesn't need to be proven. It only needs to be lived. In today's manipulative world, you don't need to become harsher, colder, or learn to play the game. You only need to become deeply, unapologetically yourself. Because the most terrifying thing to a manipulator is a soul that no longer doubts itself. Have you ever realized the most dangerous thing a manipulator can do isn't yelling at you? It's making you yell at yourself. When they sense their old tactics no longer work, that your eyes have changed, your voice no longer trembles, and your steps are no longer tentative, they don't give up. They evolve. From direct control, they move to something more destructive, dismantling your trust in your own perception. And that is the costliest form of manipulation. Because if they succeed, they don't have to hurt you anymore. You'll do it for them. Carl Jung once wrote that the shadow doesn't disappear by avoiding it. It only grows in the unconscious and eventually overtakes us from within. In this case, you're not only facing your own shadow, but also carrying the unacknowledged shadow of someone else. The manipulator, instead of owning their inner chaos, chooses to reflect it onto others through a distorted mirror. And you, unknowingly, become the shattered glass catching it all. They'll label you the troublemaker, the one who doesn't know how to love, the unstable, cold, ungrateful one. They'll recall your tiniest mistakes, magnify them through the emotional microscope, and paint a distorted portrait of you, then hold it up as undeniable proof. And what makes it dangerous is that they can be compelling, because they believe it, and you, with your once gentle heart, sensitive to doing right, will stand there doubting your own intuition, asking, am I really the one who's wrong? You might start revisiting moments when you were angry, when you set boundaries, and conclude that you were too sensitive, too harsh, too distant. But what you're forgetting is, each of those actions was a small voice from the awakened part of you, a part that had begun separating from dependency, and the very reason you're under attack is because you started listening to it. Jung said that manipulators can't live in the light of others. It reminds them they still dwell in untouched darkness. So they choose to pull you down rather than rise. They're not trying to win back your love. They're trying to regain control. Because if you no longer need them to feel worthy, then in their eyes, you're threatening their very existence. And so they fire their last weapon, shadow reversal. Where once they hurt you and apologize, now they hurt you and say, you hurt them. Where once they called control love, now they call your freedom selfishness. They flip the emotional script. And in an age where we're learning to honor our feelings more than ever, that becomes a deadlier weapon than ever before. You no longer know what's real. And that's the goal. Not to make you love them again, but to make you stop loving yourself. Because a person rooted in their inner clarity cannot be controlled, and to a manipulator, that's the ultimate threat. But Jung also gave us a powerful tool, the ability to observe ourselves without judgment. When you feel pulled into that emotional spiral, pause, take a breath, ask, is this a genuine feeling or a reaction triggered by old wounds? Be the observer, not the victim. Remember, if someone needs you to be the villain in their story, to feel like a victim, then the best thing you can do is not play the role. Withdrawing from their distorted mirror isn't coldness, it's sacred self-protection. It's your soul's most profound message, that you deserve to live in truth, not in a reflection twisted by someone else's unresolved pain. Jung once said, you cannot awaken someone who is pretending to sleep. And you also cannot prove the truth to someone who's already decided they don't want to see it. So please don't waste your energy trying to convince anyone you're not the person they've painted. Use that energy to return to yourself, to touch the peace, clarity, and strength waiting for you on the other side of the manipulation storm. And then, when you stand firm again, you'll realize something remarkable. You don't need anyone to believe you're good. You need to believe it yourself. Because in this upside-down world full of masks and projections, the one who dares to live truthfully, silently, but without compromise, is the one who breaks the game entirely. You might think that once you leave the manipulator, everything ends, that just saying enough will stop the game. But Jung pointed out the opposite. When an individual begins the process of individuation, the journey of becoming themselves, no longer living through the image others project onto them, that's precisely when they step into the harshest test. Not from the world, but from the chain reaction of the very shadow they just refused to collude with. When you no longer want to play the role of the healer, you'll be called selfish. When you stop apologizing for your feelings, they'll say you're cold. When you refuse to carry someone else's emotional burden, they'll tell you you've changed. And they're right. You have changed, not in the way they had hoped. Carl Jung called this phenomenon the night sea journey, the soul's voyage through darkness. It's not glamorous. No one hands you a medal for stepping out of an old role. On the contrary, you will be alone. You will be misunderstood. But in that pitch-black night, what you discover won't be an external light. It will be the inner light that was never seen before. And when you start to see things clearly, the facades, the inverted shadows, the sugar-coated emotional manipulation, you enter what Jung described as psychological disillusionment, a pain no one else sees, but you feel like a blade to the soul. Because truth doesn't just awaken you, it severs your attachment to what you once clung to. And you're forced to face one of the oldest fears. If I am no longer who others needed me to be, then who am I? This is the point at which many people turn back. They compromise, they return to the role, they choose peace over freedom. But if you are brave enough not to turn around, you'll reach a turning point, a fortress within, where you begin to feel yourself, not through others' eyes, but through your own stillness. And something strange begins to happen. You realize you don't hate the manipulator. You no longer feel rage. You only think sorrow, not because you're weak, but because you understand. They were never fighting you. They were battling a shadow they'd never dared to face. And you, the one who reflected that truth, accidentally became the mirror that terrified them. Carl Jung said, "Mirrors don't lie, but they terrify people who can't face the truth. And now you are that mirror." You'll notice a paradox. The quieter you become, the louder they get. The clearer you become, the more chaotic they become. Because your peace is the heaviest blow to a system built on control. When you stop reacting, the game ends. Not with an explosion, but with the collapse of a structure that only survived by making you doubt yourself. And then, after everything, you realize you don't need to win, you need to be free. You don't need others to understand you correctly. You need not to betray your own truth. And in a world obsessed with external validation, the one who can live quietly in inner reality is the strongest of all. So if you find yourself in the middle of the storm, amid accusations, reversals, and subtle attacks, remember, you are not wrong. You are awakening. And to those still living in illusion, the awakened are always seen as threats. Jung wasn't just a psychoanalyst. He was a spiritual ferryman, guiding us through the fog of ego, shadow, and manipulation. And you, even if you've never sat in his therapy room, are walking the very path he mapped out over a century ago. What remains now is not to turn back or to justify. It is to keep walking, alone perhaps, but free. Because once you understand the mechanics of the shadow, you're no longer governed by it. And when that happens, no one can ever use it to control you again. You may be used to being blamed for things you didn't do, but nothing prepares you for being blamed, for the person you're becoming. When you start growing stronger, clearer, and more self-possessed, that's when the final attack hits. Jung called it inversion projection, a psychological reversal where the manipulator attributes to you everything they're doing while denying it in themselves. They don't just say you're wrong, they say you are the manipulator. And the most painful part isn't the accusation itself. It's that some part of you starts to believe it, because you were once conditioned to think, I must be wrong so that others can be right. Jung understood this. In his analysis, someone who has lived their life based on other people's emotions often loses the ability to distinguish between real guilt and projected guilt. The manipulator knows this, and they exploit it. They use your own kindness, compassion, and empathy against you. It's like being slapped with your own hands, not because you're guilty, but because your heart is too soft. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." When you become stronger, it forces others to confront their own weakness. When you're no longer their emotional punching bag, they feel empty, and they get angry. Not because you're wrong, but because your very existence, whole, awake, and no longer obedient, exposes what they don't want to see in themselves. But here lies the turning point. Because once you realize this, you no longer need to win the argument. You no longer feel the need to explain, justify, or prove anything. You simply withdraw, not out of cowardice, but from a deep inner mastery. When you know you are not what others are projecting onto you, you step out of the collective theater where everyone is watching a distorted version of you, and you return to the truth. This is the highest form of protection. Jung called it individuation, the process of de-identifying with false roles, breaking free from social masks, and becoming a whole person. Not a good person, a kind soul, or a healer, but you with light and shadow, with clear boundaries, with self-respect that can't be manipulated. You are no longer the reactor. You are the observer. You're no longer trapped in a place someone else wrote. You are holding the pen. And at this point, no matter what others do, manipulate, fabricate, blame, attack, you see it for what it is, a battle they're having with the shadow they refuse to heal. This isn't an easy phase. There will be nights you want to return to your old role, where you were predictable, agreeable, forgiving to a fault. But if you hold your ground, something strange happens. You start attracting different people, not those who drain you, but souls who have also walked through fire, who were also accused for their truth. These people don't need you to fill their emptiness. They come to walk beside you, not to lean on you. And then, the very things that once wounded you, your sensitivity, your depth, your brutal honesty, become sacred weapons, not for attack, but for protection. Protecting your limits, protecting your light, protecting the integrity of a soul no longer bent by the need to be loved. Jung never romanticized this process. He knew the price of freedom is misunderstanding. The cost of clarity is being called too sensitive, too intense, or worse, the problem. But he also knew whoever dares to walk beyond illusion no longer lives in fear, and whoever doesn't live in fear cannot be controlled. So if you're in that stage now, where the attacks are coming from the people you once trusted most, where you're being cornered and forced to prove you're not the villain, remember, this isn't the truth. This is the shadow rising and thrashing. And your calm presence is the light that's exposing it. You don't need to scream. You don't need to fight for justice in a courtroom that was never fair. You need to stand still in your truth. And when you do that, you don't just heal yourself. You begin to recover an entire system cracking under the weight of collective delusion. When you move beyond the psychological breakdown caused by manipulation, the first thing you encounter is not peace, but a strange emptiness. No one is blaming you anymore. But there's also no one left to please. No more judgmental stares, but no applause either. And suddenly you realize, all this time you had been living through the reflection of yourself in other people's eyes. Now that the mirror is shattered, and you're left standing before the question Jung believed was at the heart of every healing process. If no one is judging me, then who am I? This is the point where many people return to their old comfort zones, even though they were toxic, because at least they're familiar. At least in those places you know your role. But if you dare to stay in this void, without running away, without finding someone new to attach to, without seeking another manipulator to save you, then you are truly beginning the journey of individuation. And this silence, though it may feel like a dead space at first, gradually becomes the fertile soil where the seed of your authentic self can grow. Carl Jung called this phase the night sea journey, a voyage across a dark ocean where all surface lights disappear and you're left alone with yourself. No one is guiding you, no applause, no criticism, just you and that quiet voice within, the one you ignored for too long while trying to please the world. It's in this darkness that you begin to rediscover the things you once dismissed. A small hobby you used to love, a passion you buried because it wasn't practical, a lifestyle you once dreamed of but never dared to pursue out of fear of judgment. These things, fragile at first, gradually become the thread that leads you out of the dark. This is the phase Jung considered the most sacred, when the individual is no longer absorbed by the collective, no longer swept up in societal roles, and begins to build a symbolic life, where every choice, every action, every emotion becomes a reflection of the connection between the conscious and the unconscious. You're no longer just surviving. You begin to live as an expression of something more profound. Maybe you call it the soul, the true self, or who I really am. And the miracle is, once you enter this stage, the old manipulator no longer has power over you. Not because they've changed, but because you have. You no longer emit the signal of, I need to be validated. You're no longer playing the old game where you must apologize to be loved or explain yourself to be forgiven. You exist, clearly, with boundaries, with awareness, and without shame. And that is what terrifies them more than any resistance ever could. Jung once said, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And in this final part of your journey, you no longer see the shadow in others. You see it in yourself. You're no longer afraid of your weaknesses, your selfishness, your wounds. You understand you are neither a victim nor a hero. You are a human being in the constant process of becoming. When you reach this point, everything in life starts to change. Not dramatically, but silently and deeply. You no longer need 10 friends to feel enough. One real connection is sufficient. You no longer need to be liked by everyone. You need not betray yourself. You no longer need the world to call you kind. Your conscience knows you lived truthfully. Maybe you'll feel lonelier, but you won't feel empty. Perhaps you'll be misunderstood, but you won't need to be understood to feel worthy. And the most critical shift, you're no longer easily manipulated. No one can guilt you for having boundaries. No one can make you feel wrong for saying no to what doesn't align. And that is what makes you someone who can no longer be controlled. Jung believed that if more people dared to embark on this journey, not with resistance but with awareness, then society would undergo a transformation. Because those who have walked through manipulation, shadow, and inner guilt are no longer governed by fear. They don't need to conquer anyone. They don't need to be validated. They only need to live their inner truth. And in a world collapsing under the weight of falsehood, they, silent yet powerful, are the deepest kind of revolution. And now, as the journey nears its end, perhaps the most precious thing isn't that you escape the manipulator. It's that you've stepped out of your old self, the one who craved approval, feared being misunderstood, and strained to appear good. You no longer need to be a hero, nor do you need to play the victim. You only need to live your truth. And that truth doesn't need to be explained, doesn't need to be believed, doesn't need to be understood. It only needs to be held by you. Carl Jung once said, "We do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." You've done that, quietly, without needing validation. And it has transformed the way you exist in the world. The people who once manipulated you may still be there, but they no longer occupy space in your mind. They no longer dictate your actions. They no longer keep you up at night, questioning yourself or shrinking under guilt. And that is freedom. A kind of freedom that doesn't come from escaping them, but from no longer letting them live inside you. You've learned how to hold on to your truth amid the noise of blame. You've learned how to stay still when others try to drag you back into the cycle of guilt. And you've learned that strength isn't about fighting. It's about not being pulled in anymore. If someone ever made you feel small, remember this. It's only when you truly begin to grow that they try to make you shrink. So the ultimate, most beautiful, most radical form of defiance is not defeating them. It's no longer necessary for them to feel worthy. And if you're in that phase now, keep walking, silently, steadily, without explanation, and don't look back. Not because you hate them, but because you've finally chosen yourself.